Hello, everyone, and welcome to Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh's 350th anniversary discussion, Halting Plant Extinction. I'm Simon Milne, I'm the Regius Keeper here at the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, and I am delighted to introduce this exciting event. Given that the future of social well-being, indeed our survival, depends on plants, there cannot be a more important discussion to be had. The huge number of participants in this discussion, and I gather there are over 700 people registered. Wow, that's an incredible number, isn't it? Given that large number, it must give us a lot of hope at a time when such a large proportion of the world's plants are facing extinction. And I look forward to hearing more about the discussions about numbers later on. Public awareness of biodiversity conservation is invariably focused on the charismatic megafauna. And I think we have a real challenge to raise the profile of threats, need, and solutions to the plight of plants and fungi. And of course, that must be supported by outstanding science, global science. And the need to look at this issue holistically is, I would suggest, absolutely vital. Biodiversity research and conservation are inextricably linked with climate change and public health. And I reckon that this message needs to be adopted and amplified much more by politicians and other key decision makers around the world. Here at Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, addressing the biodiversity crisis and climate emergency is at the very much the heart of our work. It's the driver for our research, our conservation, horticulture, education, and our public engagement programs. The origins of our garden lie in the establishment of a physic garden 350 years ago in Edinburgh. And that was for research, education, and public health. So in many respects, there is a great continuity of purpose over the centuries. What has changed is the scale of the challenge in terms of threats, and more positively, in terms of global cooperation. We can only succeed in our quest to halt plant extinctions through effective international partnerships. And this event is very much a manifestation of that. It's wonderful to see the esteemed and international lineup of panelists today, and I very much look forward to hearing much wisdom and foresight over the next hour as we have our discussions right across the world. I hope that this event will encourage us to do even more to get out and about to inspire more people about plants right across the breadth of society, and to enable people to take and to call for action. Here at the garden, we have in a normal year around 1 million visitors. When you add to that the number of visitors visiting all botanic gardens around the world, we have an amazingly broad and wide audience to inspire and influence. It's a wonderful opportunity. We're all striving to do more for the conservation of plants and fungi. That's why we're all here today. And this event can only but help to move us forward in a very positive direction. So please, let's make sure that we grasp this opportunity and we use it as a force for change. Thank you very much. Have a great hour. I look forward to the discussions. And I'll now hand over to Pete. Hello, Pete.
Hello, I'm Pete Hollingsworth, Director of Science at the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh. And following the welcome from Simon Milne on behalf of the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh, I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome from the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Scotland's National Academy and co-host of today's event. The Royal Society of Edinburgh has a wide-ranging remit covering science and technology, arts, humanities, social science, business, and public services. And it's the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh that have worked together to organise today's event. And I'm going to act as one of the co-chairs of the event, and I'd like to introduce Julieth Serrano, who will act as co-chair.
Thank you, Pete. And thank you everyone for being here today. My name is Julieth Serrano, and I am excited to be here and be part of this discussion on such important topics on science and conservation. I am a researcher in ecology, biogeography, and conservation at the University of Exeter in the UK, where I co-coordinate the ecology work for the Bioresilience project. And my current career interests are on studying drivers of change and variation in plant species function, composition, and structure, and to aid conservation and raise awareness on forest degradation and biodiversity loss. I have also worked in my home country, Colombia, towards generating links between science and local forest management. And while connecting science and conservation is urgent, currently we are facing a global event in which extinction rates have increased, and for plant species, they have been reported to be up to 500 times higher than what we will expect from natural processes alone. These alarming rates call for action. And today, here, focusing on a botanical perspective, we have gathered together with a panel of international experts to present up-to-date information regarding this crisis and to discuss ways forward towards halting plant extinction. Peter.
Thanks, Julieth. So the format from here on is that we'll introduce our distinguished panel members, and then each panel member will give a brief presentation and opening remarks. And then we'll move on to an open Q&A with the audience. So questions, you can submit questions at any time via the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. Today's event's due to end at 3 o'clock, and the event will be recorded and available to view on the Royal Society of Edinburgh's YouTube channel over next week. So now to introduce our panel.
Okay. So as a member of our panel, we have Professor Sandra Díaz. Professor Sandra is interested in plant functional traits and general patterns of functional specialization, their effects on ecosystems and interactions with global change drivers. She constructed the first global quantitative picture of essential functional diversity of vascular plants and its effects on ecosystem properties and contributions to societies. She also combines her plant ecology studies with interdisciplinary work on how different societies value and reconfigure nature. And she is also the co-chair of the IPBES Global Assessment.
And our second panel member is Dr. Malin Rivers, who's currently managing the Global Tree Assessment and overseeing red listing activities at BGCI, Botanic Gardens Conservation International, and they're working in partnership with a range of experts and institutes across the globe. She's also involved in developing and managing the BGCI databases Threat Search and the Global Tree Search. She's the chair of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List Technical Working Group and the Red List Authority Coordinator of the IUCN Species Survival Commission Global Trees Specialist Group.
Thank you. Our next panel member is Professor Jin Chen. He is the director of the Sichuan-Bana Tropical Botanical Garden, Chinese Academy of Sciences, and a principal investigator for the ecology and evolution of plant-animal interactions. He has a strong interest in environmental education, and he focuses on fundamental ecology research linking biological and social problems. He also makes conservation and education more effective by implementing multidisciplinary methods. Professor Chen is the first chair of the Chinese Union of Botanical Gardens that was established in 2013 to promote networking and capacity building of Chinese botanical gardens.
And our fourth panelist is Professor Corneille Ewango, a conservation biologist and environmentalist, and a professor at the University of Kisangani in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He's worked there for more than 25 years with the Wildlife Conservation Society at the Okapi Wildlife Reserve and has been given a number of awards, including the Goldman Environmental Prize for his efforts to protect the reserve during the Civil War. He also established a herbarium to further understanding of the flora of the reserve, and his current research covers the floristics, ecology, and ecological economics of the tropical forests and peatlands of the Congo Basin and how they'll respond to future environmental change. Now, I'm really hoping Cornel is able to join us. We've been experiencing some technical problems today. I'm hoping we get those fixed, so fingers crossed that we'll get that sorted in the next few minutes. And now what we're going to do is just have a series of short introductory presentations from the panel, providing background to the scale of the challenge, and importantly, to highlight the work and the perspectives of this very distinguished panel.
Because plants seem to be everywhere, we don't tend to think they are in trouble, but they are, as indeed is the whole fabric of life on Earth. The latest global reports show that human actions have directly altered roughly 3/4 of the planet's terrestrial ecosystems, and local terrestrial communities have lost, on average, about 20% of their original diversity. They have always been extinctions, but the overall extinction rate is now at least tens to hundreds of times higher than the average over the past 10 million years. For seed plants, it's between 18 and 26 extinctions per million species year, up to 500 times higher than the background extinction rate for plants. As a consequence, more species of plants and animals are now threatened with extinction than at any other time in human history. And we find similar trends for domesticated diversity. The number of traditional varieties of food crops cultivated and consumed around the world have decreased sharply over the past century. Globally, the proximate causes of this decline in nature are land use change, direct exploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species, roughly in this order. Now, if I were to keep just one message from our global assessment, I would keep this one. While these proximate causes, perhaps with the exception of climate change, tend to act locally, in our globalized world, the root causes are mostly long distance, diffuse, and social, economic, and political in nature. They are related to global consumption patterns, transport, diet, and global trade. So acting locally where the plants are going extinct, of course, can have an immediate positive effect, like a first aid or intensive care treatment. But to really tackle the loss of plant life on Earth, it is essential to act at the level of these socioeconomic root causes. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Malin Rivers, based at Botanic Garden Conservation International, working on the global tree assessment, where we're producing extinction risk assessment of all the world's 60,000 tree species. Why are we doing this? Well, without knowing the conservation status of a plant, how do we know if it needs protection? In order to halt plant extinctions and to more effectively conserve plant diversity worldwide, we need tools and available information to be able to prioritize which plants to focus our conservation action on. With information from these assessments, we can then better do conservation planning and ultimately protect plant diversity. The goal of achieving conservation assessments for all plants is not new. It has been in the global strategy for plant conservation for nearly 20 years. Its most commonly used and most widely recognized system is the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species. Currently, there are over 43,000 plant species assessed on the IUCN Red List, which represent 13% of known plants. However, IUCN Red List assessments are not the only approach utilized. Assessments are also published in other databases, across the scientific literature and also in national and regional red lists. At BGCI, we have collated all known digitally available conservation assessments for plants and published these in the Threat Search database, which now has over 139,000 plant species, representing about 40% of plants. And this is clearly great progress, but it still means that for 60% of plants, we have no information on their extinction risk. How can we make best available decisions on plant conservation if we're missing 60% of the picture? It has taken considerable amounts of financial resources and human capacity to achieve this progress with plant assessments. But in order to address the shortfalls in assessment coverage, we need to develop new and innovative approaches. And I'd like to illustrate this with an expansion of the diagram I showed you earlier. Actually, rather than just using extinction risk assessment to prioritize the planning and protection of plants, we need to be more clever. First, we can use spatial metrics and models that utilize machine learning techniques to predict extinction risk of plants. These predictions can then be used to prioritize our efforts, focusing on the species or the regions predicted to be most at risk, while grouping together those species predicted to be very low risk. And finally, we need to use innovative ways to collect the data for red list assessments and package that data into the required formats. Using all these methods, for the global tree assessment, we have managed to significantly increase the output of extinction risk assessments for trees published on the IUCN Red List in the last few years. And we are on our way to achieve our targets to assess all the world's trees. So in summary, extinction risk assessments help us to determine which species are at the greatest risk of extinction. They are used to prioritize the most threatened species for conservation action, they publicize their plight, and provide information needed to plan the action needed to protect them.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to attend this discussion. I'm Jin Chen, come from Sichuan Malin Tropical Botanic Garden, China's Academy of Sciences. In January 2019, participants from all over the world gathered in Sichuan Bana for a symposium for discussing plant conservation. And then we issued the Sichuan Bana Declaration. On that declaration, we argue the extinction of any non-plant species is inexcusable. Why is that? That's come from practices in Sichuan Bana. Sichuan Bana is a biodiversity hotspot and also the cultural diversity area. 8 years ago, the Garden XTBG, we initiated a program called the Indicator of Conservation for Zero Extinction in Sichuan Bana. The idea is to using the entire conservation toolbox for regional conservation to zero extinction. So we developed the 5 steps for the actions. The first action, we collected experts from this region for 1 week indoor analysis for every native plant species in this region for their conservation schedules. And then we come out with the initial assessment, which have the 6 different categories, which is follow the IUCN category. You will see each category with a certain number of plant species. After that, we conduct a field survey to check whether those initial assessments make sense, and also is there any other new category or new plant species need to be included. So after that, we come out with a working version for the assessment. On that version, you will notice there are 345 plant species. It's our target species. And then we look at the garden for the living collections. We noticed actually the 40% of the native plant species has been collected in the garden. However, the endangered plant species only takes 28%. So our target is try to make the in-situ conservation for all the plant species to reach 100%. After 8 years, we get from the 28% to 70%, and also make some other efforts. So which means the target for zero extinction is not achieved, but we make progress. Then we asked whether the practice in Sichuan Banna can be extended to whole China. 7 years ago, China established the CUBG, Chinese Union of Botanic Gardens. Currently, we have 120 botanic gardens as members. So we say whether this practice can be extended to other regions. So with 6 years, with 2 phases, this program has extended to the 14 different regions with 14 botanic gardens and leading botanic gardens for the efforts. Over 200 experts involved in the programs. A whole area covered 37% of China. This is an ongoing program. So in conclusion, we use multiple conservation tools to achieve the zero plant extinction. Botanic garden play a leading role on that efforts. It is a doable and a challenging goal for achieving zero plant extinction. Thank you.
I would like now to welcome our panel to the discussion. And yes, to please turn on cameras and microphones. And thanks to all of us who have submitted questions already. I would like to direct the first question to Sandra. Sandra, you highlighted in your introduction that extinction threats arise from pressures that are global in scale. Where on the planet are the threats of species extinction currently the highest because of those pressures?
Thank you. The drivers are mentioned act slightly different on different organisms. There are cases of plants which are threatened to dangerous levels by direct extraction. For example, many succulents and many plants that are the sources of precious goods and essences. Increasingly, there are cases of plants that are threatened by ongoing climate change. For example, some succulents in the Southern African succulent karoo, perhaps baobabs and some large-bodied tropical forest species. But the vast majority of threatened vascular plants on Earth are at risk because of the direct destruction of their habitat, and also by spillover increases in resources, such as increased availability of water, light, nutrients, that put these plants in real disadvantage with respect to other plants, which perhaps have faster or more greedy, so to speak, lifestyles. So climate change, direct extraction, invasive species, pollution, just add to the risk on top of this habitat destruction, which is the world's most important driver of plant diversity loss. And you ask where in the world this is most serious. Well, I would say without a doubt that is in areas where we are seeing the most active land use change at the moment, which is Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and many parts of Southeast Asia. Here I'm not talking about land use for small-scale agriculture driven by local population growth. By far, the main threat is the complete replacement of vegetation over vast areas of land by industrial agriculture, mostly oriented for global markets. Obvious examples are soybeans, sugarcane, oil palm, peanuts, cotton. And within those regions of the world I mentioned, this is happening in particular in those areas where the soils and the climate are suitable for large-scale agriculture. It's not happening so much in more harsh and hostile environments. That would be my answer.
Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And really following on along that theme, Malin, that via the BGCI that you've overseen the assessment of thousands of plant species for the Red List, and just wondering if there are any thoughts on major threats to plant biodiversity that are likely to lead to extinction that come out of those threat assessments.
Thank you, Pete. Yeah, I mean, I agree with Sandra, and she's covered many of these things, but by far the biggest threat to plants is habitat loss. And it's that habitat loss we're talking about, which is conversion of land to agriculture, but it's also conversion of the land through livestock grazing, plantations, urbanization, mining, you know, a whole host of different types of drivers for that habitat loss, but that is one of the biggest threats. Another big threat, which we haven't mentioned yet really, is logging. So my work is mainly dealing with the tree assessments at the moment, and logging and wood harvesting, either for timber or for fuel, is also a major driver of threat for many, many species. And also logging and wood harvesting have obviously knock-on effects. So it might not be harvesting the species we're talking about, but the impact it has on the habitat will obviously impact other species which may not be woody species. We're also finding that invasive species and pests and diseases are increasingly becoming problematic. And that's across the board. And I guess that could also be because a lot of species have had contracted ranges, have had their genetic diversity impacted by other threats, and now new pests and diseases are coming in, and the innate ability of species to deal with those are much less. So pests and diseases are also increasing in risks, really. And the other one I also like to mention, which Sandra has mentioned, is the climate change. And it's again just exacerbating all the other threats we also talked about, but we're also finding extreme weather events increasingly also impacting species. So if we're talking small island endemics, extreme weather events, cyclones, tsunamis, that sort of thing could have devastating effect, again, on species that are probably already have had ranges contracted, and again, a lower genetic diversity to deal with any additional stress. So yeah, those I would say would be the main drivers.
Thanks, Malin.
Thank you, Malin. Professor Jin, the Sichuan-Bana Declaration on Plant Conservation states that the extinction of any known plant species is inexcusable, and that botanical gardens have a crucial role to play in plant conservation. What, in your view, is the most important contribution a botanical garden can make during the current extinction crisis?
Thank you. So I think for botanic garden play a role for halting and plant extinction, the botanic garden need to put this task as a priority of their work, which is not always the case for many of the botanic gardens. Secondly, the botanic garden need to needing the field assessment, because due to the very rapid land change and climatic change and a couple of other things, actually the conservation status for plant species change greatly. So we need to make the very periodic or regular check for that. And thirdly, botanic garden need to try to integrate all the stakeholders, all the efforts together to create a kind of collective efforts. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I've just been checking to see whether we've managed to get Cornel to join us, and I'm afraid we haven't. We'll keep trying to do that as the event goes along. But I'm going to take now the very first question that was put in the chat window, and it's from Colin Walker from the Open University. And this is a question which I think we direct at Malin. And the question is, he's interested in aloe. Last year, he's published a paper on Aloe backeri, a critically endangered, highly localized Madagascan endemic. Currently, this species is on the brink of extinction with less than a dozen plants recorded from the natural environment. And the question is, how does could the panel advise about how to get this species recognized, this conservation state recognized by the IUCN?
Yes, so I'll start responding to that. So the only way to get a species listed on the IUCN Red List is to contact the IUCN Red List and ask to have, to do an assessment and to publish that on the IUCN Red List. They might then direct you to other help. So if it was a tree, it probably would have been directed to me to help you to get that assessment on. And if it's not a tree, you'll probably be working with the Madagascar Specialist Group or other things. So basically, I would say to get it onto the IUCN Red List, you need to contact the IUCN Red List and ask to have your assessment published, basically. If you have any trouble, let me know. I can always help.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like now to take the question made by David. And Professor Jin, maybe I would like to direct this to you. It says, many botanic gardens are reintroducing single species into small areas. How do we scale this up to restore whole habitats with multiple species over large hectares?
Yes, this is a very good question. Actually, it's both the reintroduction programs, even for some restoration programs, the scale up, it's always an issue. I think the Botanic Garden need to evolve into some regional efforts to try to make those kind of scale up. So we are discussing, we enter into the era of the Anthropocene. So the conservation also call for new actions, which means we can put some of those endangered species, not only just into the wild habitats, but also we can keep in some public greenlands and then monitor that. So basically we need to, by using different approaches to slow down or halting the plant species extinction.
Thank you.
So the next question I'm going to take is from Colin Pendry, and if I could direct this to Sandra, it's, do the panel have views on the alternative paradigms of protecting areas of the planet as wilderness versus integrating conservation with other land use practices?
Yeah, excellent question. My personal view is that we shouldn't only or even predominantly focus on wilderness, pristine areas, because to me that reinforces the separation between people and the non-human living world, which in my personal view is the root cause of this whole problem. And second, because that will distract all our efforts from the vast areas of the planet, which are not wilderness, and where a lot of diversity lives, and also a lot of the problems arise, a lot of the demands, a lot of the spillovers, a lot of the pollutants arise from the non-wilderness. And you cannot really send the wilderness into a space ship to outer space. So I'm in favor of keeping wilderness, but to me, conservation at the world scale has to be across the whole fabric of life, mainstreaming conservation of diversity in all the working landscapes on Earth, where we live and where we take the decisions.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that of course it's extremely important to protect wilderness areas, but those enormous benefits of connecting humans with nature and also keeping sight of the problems that human actions have and the pressures that they put on the planet. So that kind of integration across both of those areas has been critically important.
Yeah, absolutely. I would like to direct the next question maybe to Malin, well, both Malin and Sandra. It's made by Sunny, and it says, a question in relation to prioritizing species to protect. I think it will be reasonable to prioritize the protection of endangered species that have a relatively bigger role in ecosystem functioning, especially keystone species. to what extent is this done these days? Further, what do you think about moving from protection of individual species to protecting endangered habitats, as has been suggested? Will this method adequately preserve plant diversity?
I can start attempting to address that question. So if I understood, the first bit of that was, should we focus on the endangered species that are also keystone species and have great function? Yeah, okay. So, well, what we conserve is the $1 million question, really. So what I've been working on a lot is extinction risk assessments, and those assessments are just a measure of which species are at risk of going extinct. The next step in that process is obviously to say, okay, which of these species should we then have conservation action for? And some people might say that every species have intrinsic value and everything is worth conserving, and that's one approach. Another approach is to say, oh yeah, we should start with the keystone species that play a big role in our ecosystems. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we need to think about what is the drive for conservation. Some people might want to conserve medicinal plant species. Other groups might want to focus on there's this timber supply is maintained. So there's lots of different focus for conservation action. I don't think there's necessarily one way to approach this. And I just think we need to be clear about, like, all of these different things can play a role. I'd like to just briefly mention the fact where he's talking about conserving habitat rather than species. And clearly, in order to conserve the species, we need to conserve the habitat. So I would say they go hand in hand. Again, I don't think we have to choose one over the other. One danger, I think, by choosing a habitat over a species is that if we're not looking on a species level, we will lose components of that habitat. And we probably don't know exactly how all the species components play a role in a habitat and what are the impacts of actually losing species within it. So I would just be really careful on taking a complete habitat approach to it, just to ensure that we're not losing some essential parts of the habitat, that an ecosystem that people hadn't recognized at that point.
Yeah, absolutely relevant. The diversity of conservation actions and strategies, absolutely.
I can add some. I agree with everything. Yeah, I agree with everything Malin said. I would like to add a couple of nuances. In terms of whether conserving keystone species, which are also critically endangered, then we have to remember that some species may not be officially extinct and yet functionally extinct. A number of species which are classified as critically endangered, they are so because there are very, very few left, very, very few individuals left. That means that very likely they are functionally extinct in the sense that the role they were having in their ecosystems is probably not being played anymore. What does it mean? It means that in trying to keep functional keystone species, we not only have to look at the critically endangered one. Many species may be just vulnerable, but because they are critically important for a function, and in order to perform that function, they need to be in sufficient numbers, otherwise they don't play it, then they may be also the focus of conservation, right? In other words, if you are looking at important functional roles, you need to start much earlier than critically endangered, right? Which is sometimes not the case for things like conserving phylogenetic diversity or whatever, in which, provided the species has not gone global extinct, that's fine, right? in terms of the conserving for all species or conserving the functional important ones, I think that Malin captured my thinking. Depending on your objectives, you get very different choices. And to me, there's no scientifically right answers. The answer depends on your values. But according to your values, you do have different priorities, no doubt about it. And in terms of whether conserving habitat or species or genetic diversity, I think probably we need a multi-pronged approach, because genes and species and ecosystems are of course all interconnected, but they are not neatly nested within each other like Russian dolls. So it's not like by conserving ecosystems, you for sure conserve everything in it, and the other way around. By keeping the key species, you conserve the habitat. And I can give you examples. For example, you can keep the habitat very well, but if the species is a species of high interest for someone, people will get there. And even if the habitat otherwise gets perfect, it just looks perfect, they will just find a way to the species, and the species will go extinct. And the other way around. Sometimes you can save the species itself from extinction by ex situ conservation, and the whole habitat disappears. So it's crucially important that the multi-pronged approach, species, genetic diversity within species and habitats are considered together and in coordination.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I think that's a really critically important view, and it's too often it's the case that if one takes care of one aspect of the system, that everything else will be looked after. And of course, there are many risks with that, as you've just so perfectly articulated. So the next question, this is for Jin, and it's a question about environmental education, and it's from Chris Blackstone, who asks, can you describe the ways you're reaching many thousands of school children around the plant projects and the conservation work you're delivering? And it's really just asking there for some insights into your work in environmental education.
So for the education, in our case, we focus on the two major groups, which is related to the Zero Extinction Project. One is the kids in the school. So for whole the area, we have 43 schools. So on the one hand, with our colleagues, go to the schools, try to conduct some programs to make the school kids to make link to the nature and do some observation about the nature, and also give some lectures. On the other hand, we can invite some of those kids to visit our garden, since it's not very far away. It's sort of kind of 100 kilometers away. And another audience, it's villagers. So we often hold a sort of kind of festival. For example, orchids. It's one of the key issue, because villagers love orchids. Then the orchids is a major group that become extinct. So we propagate orchids, and then we send to the villagers and ask them to grow at their home, and then we do some activities and to show both the conservation status of orchids and don't harvest orchids from wild and cultivate orchids, sort of kind of things.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next question maybe could be addressed by Malin. Is made by John, and he says, given the scarcity of financial and scientific resources for active conservation, what is the role of international agencies in coordinating major programs for the protection of rare habitats, such as the peatlands in Scotland and South America?
Could you just repeat the actual question at the end? Sorry. What's the?
Yes. It says, what is the role of international agencies in coordinating major programs for the protection of rare habitats, such as the peatlands in Scotland and South America?
Well, so, I mean, I work at the Botanic Gardens Conservation International, and so we're a membership organisation of all the botanic gardens around the world. And so, I mean, there's an absolute key in the international community to take responsibility and leadership for conservation action. And I think it's really key to have a bit of an overview to make sure that there is coordinated action. Again, as we were talking about, just conserving a few species in a small plot and then scaling that up and having an impact on a large scale is clearly key. And I think this is happening in various places. You know, there's the botanic garden community working together to achieve, you know, parts that are great, you know, a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. But obviously there are other organizations that are also doing similar roles in other parts. So I think, you know, I guess the botanic gardens are definitely doing that on the ex situ scale and also some in situ. I don't know if someone else has got a better example of in situ conservation, and the Scotland side, I'm afraid I'm not an expert on.
Thank you.
So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to whiz on to the next questions because we've got so many of them in the queue here. So I'm just going to jump to one now, and I think this one is perhaps best for Sandra, and it's from Tom Marr, who's asking about the crosstalk between the people associated with land use change and the protagonists of biodiversity conservation, and he's making the point that the intent of the forces that are bringing about habitat destruction is not habitat destruction, it's about addressing other societal needs and food security and other resource demands. And his question is this one dialogue or is it lots of different dialogues that's going on? And I think this is going to kind of really just trying to explore how we bring together these conflicting demands on our land.
Well, that's a £1 million question. I would say there are very many intersecting dialogues. I take it that by the people involved in land use change, you mean the agricultural sector, that kind of things, company,
yeah.
Right? Okay. I would say that whenever the interest of one group can be taken care by not directly damaging the interest of the other group, that's easy. You know, in many cases, very small changes can be done and do a lot of good, right? Because it was an unintended, an involuntary consequence, and those who were doing it didn't even realize. It was easy changes, technological changes. I mean, for animals, there are a lot of examples like changing the fishing gear or things like that. When it gets much more tricky is when the interest of different groups collapse. Yeah? When there is a clash between the interests of, I don't know, normal citizens, conservationists, and particular groups that say, I'm sorry about your little plant, but I need to make more money, right? Yeah, it's as simple as that. And there is, that's the really difficult thing to start. And there we need the scientists to sit at the table, but we need we need the different sectors of society, the representative sectors of societies, the organizations of the industry, the government from municipal to national, the unions, all those civil societies sitting at the table. Otherwise, with science only, we don't get there. But I think it can be done. It's going to be difficult, but it can be done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's key to create connections. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. But I think it can be done, and step by step, it does count. The next question has been asked by Max Coleman, and he says, a key role for botanic gardens is clearly to complete individual species extinction risk assessments. It seems that botanic gardens can only effectively conserve a tiny fraction of diversity ex situ. How might we effectively up our game on ex situ conservation? Will more seed banks will be the obvious solution? If Professor Jin maybe could help us with that one.
So the question is the capacity for ex situ conservation is very limited. Is that the question?
Yeah, he asked, how might we effectively up our game, talking about botanic gardens, on ex situ conservation? Will more seed banks be one obvious solution?
Surely, the seed bank, this technology are available for many of the plant species, particularly for the temperate plant species, even for the tropical plants, which is called the recalcitrant plant species. The technology developed quite fast. So in the future, probably some seed banking technology can also be available to sort of kind of plants. But one thing I want to emphasize, so to ex situ conservation, it's not the end of the whole process. So we need to study on the propagation, we need to do reintroduction. Although reintroduction it's a heavy task. It's not easy to achieve for all the species, but basically ex situ conservation, it's sort of kind of in between process. It's not the final stage.
Many thanks, Jin. And so actually the next question is, there's one from Rebecca Lewis, which is on a local level in our own communities, what's the best steps we can take to help support plant biodiversity? And there's a related question by Gwyneth Hammond, who's saying, as a small gardener experimenting with permaculture and growing plants, would like to know what I can do in my small area of land to slow down plant extinction. And I just wondered there, Jin, with your experience of working with the local communities around Sesrambana Tropical Botanic Garden, do you have thoughts on the kind of the general guidance to give to people to start taking action themselves?
I think something we already done, some remaining habitats or the forest patches, which have the value for conservation due to certain reason. For example, some small patches of the limestone forest in our area, which is critical for some of the orchid species. So we propose to the community manage or community support small protected area. That has been done here, several cases. On the other hand, we are going to initiate some program, try to bring the public engagement for some specific endangered species by planting these plant species in their, for example, in their living green space, and then monitor that. We are not yet started this, but we think this is not only just for saving the plants, but also bring public more engaged. It's also a kind of educational program.
And I think this is a really important role for botanic gardens, and a growing role for botanic gardens to facilitate local communities to look after biodiversity and come up with ideas for ways of managing local habitats.
At this moment, well, thank you for all that very interesting debate. As it happens on interesting conversations, we're running out of time. And I would like, before we end, I would like to ask the panelists could you please each close by highlighting a key priority action that will be important in the quest to halt plant extinction?
I can start if you want. I would like to say that the most critical action, and maybe the bottom line, is to re-invite living nature into people's everyday life. To recover the idea that we are threads in a tangled living fabric, whether we like it or not. It's not a decision, we are. We just need to take care of that realization. That seems very romantic, but is nothing but romantic. It's not romantic at all. In practice means something which is quite a jargony word, but I think is the proper technical word, means mainstreaming biodiversity. That means incorporating biodiversity considerations in everything we do, not just protecting some area, right? So decidedly disencouraging activities that are simply too bad for too many people and for nature, and you disencourage them by command and control regulation and or by economic incentives and disincentives. It means eating differently, stopping using some products as much as before or stopping at all, designing different urban landscapes, etc. The bottom line, I would say, is to go beyond the urgent, intensive local treatment to say the plant where it grows and think broadly. Think about plant-friendly trade, plant-friendly legislation, transport policy, plant-friendly industry and energy policy. To me, that's the secret, and that's a difficult but the really necessary thing to do. And I fully agree that botanical gardens are in a prime position to facilitate and catalyze this, not only because they're local engagement, but because of their much more than local engagements worldwide. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now to Malin, are you happy for your closing remark?
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. So we need tools and information to be able to prioritize which plants to focus our conservation action on, really. And so my priority here is really knowledge, or I would say sharing knowledge. So I think sharing knowledge globally will be essential, because without knowledge and without knowing what species we have, where they are and their conservation status, it will be impossible to avoid plant extinctions. So my biggest priority would be to share knowledge, use the technological advances that we have, and just through the sharing of knowledge, actually create a better place for plants.
Thank you.
Professor Jin, would you like to go next?
Yes, I would say preventing plant extinction or halting the plant extinction, it's a doable task. Now it's time to call for action at the local scale, and also call for partnership, both in the local scale and internationally. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm afraid we've got to draw the event to a close now. That we're approaching 3 o'clock, and a big thank you to all the panel members and to you, the audience, for joining and taking part. I'd like to say particularly thanks to Mark Hughes and Susie Huggins at RBGE and Hannah Bentley at the Royal Society of Edinburgh for bringing the event together. And it's been an extremely thought-provoking event. We've had some fascinating insights and thoughts from the panel members and some really interesting and thought-provoking questions. And I'm so sorry we haven't had time to answer all of those, but even just reading through those questions is just helping the process of thinking about the great challenges that we're facing. And I guess one comes away with the clear overriding message of the scale of this challenge, the need for prioritized actions, for the issues to be tackled at global and local scales, and the critical urgency of an accelerated response now to conserve plant biodiversity for the benefit of people and the planet. Thank you all for joining us. It's been a wonderful event. A feedback survey will appear when we close the event off, but just to finish by thanking the panelists and you, the audience, for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.